It was the summer of '81, and I had been the paper boy for the cul-de-sac that I lived on for about 2 years at that point. I had gotten into a really solid routine for myself, and always made sure that I was out of the front door on my bike by 3:15 in the morning, so that I could pick up the papers by 3:30 and start my route. I only had to deliver papers to 6 roads with houses on them, one of which was my own. In total, on a good day, it took me about an hour and a half to 2 hours to get that done. If I finished early enough, I got to help out around the office for a bit and do things like file paperwork and set up the coffee for the morning shift. That morning was a particularly hot and humid one, so I intended on doing my route as fast as I possibly could. That way I could spend some time in the air-conditioned office. I admit that I had been rushing that day, so I wasn't aware of my surroundings. But about halfway through my route, I couldn't help but shake the feeling that I was getting followed. I kept seeing the same car pass me as I made my way through my route, but I really didn't think anything of it at the moment. That was until I was preparing to make a left turn onto the road next to mine, and I felt the back tire of my bike get slammed by something. My bike flew out from underneath me, and I was thrown to the ground. That was when I noticed the car that hit me. It was the same car that I had seen multiple times that morning. I was in a daze after hitting my head on the pavement and couldn't do much to fight back as a man emerged from the driver's side of the car, picked me up, and dragged me into the back seat. He proceeded to close the door and then got back into the driver's seat. I attempted to sit up and open the door, but there was no handle attached to the door of the back seat. I was trapped. We drove in the car for about 2 hours before he pulled us onto a long dirt road, which led us to an old baby blue single-story house. I was in and out of consciousness for most of the ride, but every chance I got, I banged and pleaded for the man to set me free. He didn't say much to me during the trip, aside from telling me to relax and that everything was going to be fine. My captor threw the car into park and proceeded to get out and pull me from the back seat. As soon as my feet hit the pavement, I did everything I could do to fight back. Sadly, the man was much larger than I was, and he easily overpowered me. I fought my hardest, but he still managed to drag me over to his home, and once inside, he walked me down a dimly lit hallway to a door that led downstairs. I guess he had grown impatient by then, because instead of walking me down, he shoved me and sent me flying down the stairs. He didn't follow me down right away, so I took a second to look around for anything that I might have been able to use as a weapon. I could hear him walking around upstairs as the floorboard above my head creaked and shifted under his weight. After a moment or so, the man threw the basement door open and came down the stairs. Only now, he had a camera in his hands pointed right at me. "That's it," he said. "I have someone that is going to pay good money for you. Give me a smile," he asked. I just stood there frozen, but once again, he grew impatient and screamed, "Smile!" This time I listened to what he told me. After having me stand in front of the camera for a bit longer, the man who abducted me left me and went upstairs. I winced as I heard the sound of the basement door locking from the other side. The first night I was in the basement, I used all of my energy trying to figure out a way to escape. There was no way though. Every time I went up the stairs toward the door, it was like he knew. He would begin yelling down at me that trying to leave was pointless. I was in the basement for 4 days before I saw him again. That was when it was time to sell me. He descended the stairs with rope in his hand. I tried to overpower him as he tied my hands together, but there was no use. In no time at all, I was back in the car with no handles to help me escape. It was an hour's drive from the man's house to the meeting point where I was supposed to be sold to someone. But when we pulled up to the parking lot of the hiking trail where we were supposed to be meeting the other man at, there was a squadron of police cars waiting for us. According to the officers, They had been trying to set up the man who had kidnapped me for nearly 6 years. They had to use an undercover officer to make contact with him as a potential buyer. After arresting the man, I was driven to the police station where my parents had been called and waiting for me. According to the officers, after searching the man's home, they found tapes that made them think he had done this to at least 6 kids across the United States. It was 2 weeks before my 10th birthday, and my mother had taken me to the mall so that she could run some errands and I could look around for a toy that I wanted for my birthday. As she was getting her hair done, I anxiously waited for the moment that I could run across the mall to the toy store and look through their section of Transformer action figures. I really wanted to get Starscream that year. Finally, my time came. My mother told me that she had to run into the shoe store really fast, but since it was right next to the toy store, I could go in ahead of her and look around. I wasted no time at all, and I ran into the toy store and began walking around the aisles until I came across the one that had all of the Transformer and Power Rangers. I looked around and picked up as many toys as my little hands could handle, and I made sure to push all of the Try Me buttons that were in sight. And sure enough, after looking around, I finally found the Starscream that I wanted. My mom hadn't come into the store yet, and I couldn't wait to tell her. So I ran out of the toy store and right into the shoe store in hopes that she would come and look at the toy with me. I began walking around the shoe store, and after a while realized that I couldn't find my mom. I tried not to panic and walked out of the store, but sadly, I walked right into a sea of people who were all shopping. I quickly became overwhelmed and I began to look around frantically for my mother. That was when a woman noticed me and came over to see if I was all right. After telling her that I couldn't find my mom, she offered to walk me to the mall security desk so that she could help me. For some reason, I felt safe and agreed to her offer. She grabbed my hand and began walking me through the mall. Only she wasn't walking me to the security desk. In fact, after about a minute of walking, I realized that we were almost outside. I began trying to pull away from her, but her grip tightened around my hand. She managed to get me through the mall doors and into the parking lot, where I saw a man standing outside of an old olive-colored car. I immediately began to scream as I tried harder and harder to pull away from the woman. And at that point, I had caught some people's attention. I screamed at the top of my lungs, and eventually someone yelled out from the sidewalk for us to hold on a minute. This interaction must have scared the woman because she let go of my wrist right away before running over to her car. I turned to the sidewalk, and to my surprise, I saw my mother running out of the doors to the mall in a panic. We made eye contact, and I ran over to her with tears running down my face. The car peeled out of the parking lot and sped away. We made a statement to the police and the mall security, but to our knowledge, the two people haven't been caught. It was the middle of my senior year of high school. I had just gotten a job at the local taco shack, a small restaurant that served Spanish and Mexican food. It was only my second week working there, but it was my first night closing. That meant that after the owner and the cooks left, I had to clean and then lock the store up before heading home. Now, I only lived about half a mile away from the taco shack, so I would walk home. That night, I cleaned everything in the restaurant, locked up, and then began heading out of the parking lot. That was when I noticed an old sedan that was still sitting in the parking lot. I tried to see if there was anyone inside as I continued to make my way toward the road, but it was too dark, so I couldn't get a good enough look. I began making my way down the road, but it wasn't long before I realized that the car had pulled out of the parking lot and now was following me closely. I thought about running, but I didn't want to seem paranoid, so I just continued walking as everything was fine. Sadly, everything was far from fine. The car quickly accelerated and pulled itself right in front of me so that I couldn't continue walking. And before I could turn around to run, two men jumped out of the passenger side and rushed me. I was thrown to the ground and then was overcome with a hail of punches and kicks until eventually I blacked out. By the time I came to, I realized my arms had been tied behind my back and I had been locked inside someone's trunk. I wiggled around and did everything I could to break my arms free, but there was no use. I was trapped in the darkness of a trunk for what I can only presume was 2 to 3 hours as the car drove along. I remember that the road got really bumpy after a while. That must have been when we pulled off the main road and onto a dirt trail. After driving down the bumpy road for a couple of minutes, the car finally came to a stop and I could hear the men up front getting out. I heard them approach the trunk. I wasn't sure what to expect when it opened. As soon as they popped the trunk, I saw 3 men standing on the outside of it, one of them holding a hunting rifle in my face. "You can get out now," he said as one of his companions began to pull me out of the trunk. He cut the bindings on my hands and then pushed me backward. The man with the rifle then lifted it into the air and said, "You have 10 minutes to run." I hesitated because I wasn't sure how to respond. That was when the man fired a single shot into the sky and yelled, "Run!" I didn't hesitate anymore. I took off running into the forest as fast as I could. I wanted to stay on the trail that the car had driven up, but my gut was telling me that I'd be safe in the cover of the trees. I ran for hours, still unsure how close my pursuers were from catching up to me. I couldn't be sure, but every time I stopped to catch my breath, I could swear that I hear twigs snapping around me. Every step I took, I was worried that I was going to hear sound of a gunshot. Hours passed, and eventually, I could see the sun coming up from the tree line. Still unsure where my captors were, I continued to run. Eventually, I began hearing the sound of slowly moving water, and I began heading toward what turned out to be a stream. I'm not typically religious, but something must have been looking out for me that morning because to my surprise, there was a father and his son fishing in the stream, right across from where I emerged from the tree line. I flagged them down, and as I fell to the ground from exhaustion, the father came rushing over to me to help me and called out for his son to get his phone. They called an ambulance and then helped me back to their truck. After hearing my story, the hospital called the police to whom I gave my statement. That was my last day working at Taco Shack, and I have a hard time walking home after dark. All I keep telling myself is that things could have turned out a lot worse.